Dear friends, welcome to part 2 of the lecture on media, culture and society. In this section, we will focus on the functional aspects of the debate surrounding media and culture, media audience, ownership and control, and its effect on media messages. Concentration of media ownership is an ongoing process whereby most of the control of media outlets today is increasingly held by a few large conglomerates. Contemporary research demonstrates increasing levels of consolidation, with many media industries already highly concentrated, where mergers and acquisitions are the norm. If studied from an ethnographic perspective, it will be seen that most of these conglomerates are based in the Western world and who operate beyond boundaries of states as transnational entities. Some of these notable media conglomerates would include, and I am sure you are well aware of names such as Viacom, CBS Corporation, Time Warner, News Corporation, Vivendi, Bertelsmann, Sony Corporation, the Walt Disney, Facebook, Google, and so on and so forth. If you pick up any magazine today, or surf any website, or read a newspaper, both print and online, or watch television, chances that you have touched upon any one of these transnational entities that I have just mentioned are quite high. Most of the shares of revenue of these corporations come from overseas markets, and thus they do not have to depend on any particular country. Recent changes in this field of media business have seen the rise of digital companies as media entities. Now, this is something that has come about in the last decade or so. Facebook, Google, Amazon, etc. are relatively new entrants, but whose business model relies heavily on a single platform, the web. Both of them have become behemoths in their own right by betting heavily on the rise of social media. The social media has come to typify the rise of the audience as the interactive user, and finally the producer of messages. If you minutely observe the functionality of Facebook, for example, or let's say any other social media, you will notice that the big chunk of messages that are created every day is produced by the interactive user, or rather the audience, who also acts as the producer. What happens in turn is the cost of production of messages is almost nil. YouTube is a perfect example of such a form of media, where the videos that are uploaded on YouTube are basically shot and uploaded by the user, be it a single interactive user placed anywhere in the world, or be it any film company or any advertisement firm. Now, Indian media firms also have consolidated their reach, straddling different platforms today at the same time. When I say platforms, I mean that they are present at the level of print, television, and probably digital media as well. Although these Indian firms exist at a smaller level probably than these global transnational entities that I have just mentioned, yet given the restrictions for foreign investors to invest into Indian media today, there has been the rise of quite a large number of homegrown media behemoths, if we might call them. Bennett and Coleman, for example, Reliance Media Group, the Z Group, the Sun Group, etc., have captured a majority of the Indian media business. As a case in point, if I might cite here, ETV of the erstwhile Enadu Group had regional channels in almost all languages, giving it a pan-Indian reach. In fact, the ZTV group also followed this same model of expansion. Now, ETV came out with also the first newspaper to have editions in each district of Andhra Pradesh, where they would cater to the local demands of such localized reporting. Bennett and Coleman again, for example, which publishes the Times of India, is again a large corporate entity whose interests straddle almost all possible media platforms, right from newspaper, television channels, internet, etc. The Sun Group is another media company based in Tamil Nadu, has a bouquet of channels, but also is the service provider for direct-to-home technology called the Sun DTH. In this way, it has a strong grip over the whole media spectrum in the southern part of the country. It is at this juncture I will introduce to you the concept of the propaganda model, which is very important to note here. Now, this is a model, or rather theory, advanced by the MIT scholar Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky in their book Manufacturing Consent: The Political Economy of Mass Media, published in 1988, that argues about systemic biases in the mass media and seeks to explain them in terms of structural economic causes. The 20th century has been characterized by three developments of great political importance: the growth of democracy, the growth of corporate power, and the growth of corporate propaganda as a means of protecting corporate power against democracy. The propaganda model thus views the private media as businesses selling a product, readers and audiences, which rather than the news, to other businesses, the advertisers in this case, and relying primarily on government and corporate information and propaganda. The model puts forward 5 filters that determine the type of news that is presented in news media today. Ownership and profit motive of the medium being the first filter. The medium's funding, advertisements, is the second filter. Sourcing of the news is the third filter. Flack or criticism is the fourth filter, and anti-communist ideology being the last or the fifth filter. The first three, if I might argue, ownership, funding and sourcing, are generally regarded by the authors as being the most important in this hierarchy of filters. The model was initially propounded on their understanding of the functions of the American media, but both the scholars argue that these filters would be relevant to any society where media is not free from the clutches of business motive and profit making. The roots of the propaganda model lie in the Cold War era, when the state used to be a big source of influence for the media and used it as a tool to advance state ideology. If I might go a few years back, I can recall that Hitler used media propaganda to his advantage. Leni Riefenstahl's movie The Triumph of the Will, which was a documentary on the kind of dominance that Hitler had in his time, was nothing but one of the earliest examples of propaganda movie making. Chomsky and Herman argue that in societies where media is state controlled, it is easy to differentiate between propaganda from news. But in modern free economies, democratic societies, the way in which propaganda makes its way into content is a difficult process to ascertain. That is probably the reason why, to understand Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will as propaganda is far more easier than to understand propaganda in today's time. The scholars Chomsky and Herman argue that most media owners are today large transnational entities, as we have already talked about, but who have cross-media ownership. The main businesses of such firms might lie in some other business, and media might only be one of their ancillary business interests. Now that is a dangerous proposition. The second filter, advertisement, is what determines what we watch and read as media content. Advertisement actually subsidizes the cost of media production and make the media industry profitable. Sometimes advertisements are so powerful that they are also termed as normative reference organizations. Many scholars have in fact argued that advertisements are actually the reference point for what programs media run throughout the day. Advertisements have a great say in the kind of programming you and me watch today. Sourcing, the third filter, on the other hand, refers to the sources through which media gets its information. Official sources such as the government or large corporates take great pains to quote the media so that the news is carried and given prominence. Now, sourcing is also a means to subsidize the cost of media making, because after all, the sources provide you with free news and content. Sources therefore have a lot of influence over how we watch and what is controlled. You have to understand that media firms refer to sources as one of their greatest help, because you can easily understand source brings the cost of collection of news down considerably. Every evening in the news television channel, for example, you will also come across people who are experts on diverse issues, but actually are nothing but planted sources who would opine on every topic and want you to believe with the agenda that they have come with. Now, this is a very interesting source that we sometimes neglect or ignore. Flack, the fourth filter, is the fear of criticism for media. Any sort of criticism, for example, for media might be fatal. Media tries to avoid it at any cost. It might lead to losing of advertisements and readership, and probably to the closure of the media house in extreme cases. Many a times, government uses media firms as a entity where criticism will rein in the content of the media firms. There have been various examples. I would like to cite to you in this context the example for if I may remember correctly, fashion television, which was blacked out in more occasions than one. Now, this is a deliberate ploy by the government, a flack strategy where it reins in the television channel for showing content which the government deems inappropriate. There has also been incident of NDTV India, the popular Hindi television channel run by NDTV, where it was blacked out for a day in 2016. This is also a perfect example of flack by the government. Anti-communism as a national ideology or a national religion was at its peak during the Cold War, and this constitutes the fifth and the final filter. Now, during the Cold War, most of what the media published or carried out was influenced by this deep distrust for anything that smelled of communism. You can well understand a society that propounded capitalism, and you would view anything that smelled of communism with deep distrust. This was, after all, the height of the Cold War. Now, if we understand the propaganda model and the structure that it brings to us, to study media systems in the free market economy, where the process of acquiring news and information are as much dependent on ownership patterns and profit motives. While the information is being packaged according to the terms of the propaganda theory, the way in which the media messages are received is an area of inquiry that deserves our attention. The 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century saw a rapid increase in technological innovations sweeping the Western world, mostly technological innovations which had something to do with media and communications. Most of it emanated from the rapid increase in industrialization and urbanization of developed nations. Now, this influx of technological innovations at a rapid pace had indeed made our world topsy-turvy of sorts. We would now have to realize the fact that we were mostly moving from an agrarian and feudal society towards industrial and democratic processes. Therefore, the rise of such technological innovation, at first mostly electric in nature and later electronic towards the later part of the 20th century, brought about major changes in the way that we perceive our world today. For example, new media technologies redefined our boundaries and territories and questioned long held beliefs and customs. The telephone, let's say for example, reduced distances. Radio brought about entertainment without even wires. Or let's say television was a revolutionary concept because it combined both sound and visuals. Now, the way in which we perceive media messages, therefore, underwent a drastic shift as newer and newer technologies started coming in. This was what we might call as a paradigm shift in the understanding of media messages. Early communication scholars defined three basic ways in which, therefore, the functional purpose of mass media was achieved. Firstly, media messages were considered to be reflective in nature. Secondly, media messages were considered to be constitutive in nature. And thirdly, and most importantly, messages were considered to be transformative in nature. This proposition of the three functionalities had many critiques as well, which I will try to analyze now. Media messages as reflective of reality is of course a difficult proposition. This idea was considered deeply flawed due to the fact that media messages were indeed representational and once removed from reality. Critics would often say that even the mirror fails to be perfectly reflective with its inverse reflection, where the right appears to be the left and the left appears to be the right. Now, there is the question of the tool also here, which is to be considered, because the recording device is a conduit between the reality and the representation. Thus, the whole idea that media messages is a reflection of reality had many critiques. The second proposition, that media messages being constitutive of reality, which means that the real world outside is constituted by the media messages themselves, is an idea that had many takers in the initial days. Now, this is something probably true, that media messages, for example, our idea of America today probably is constitutive of the kind of American films or advertisements that we might have watched. But even though this might be true to some extent, there are many critics who would argue that objectivity in all its essence in representation can never be achieved. Now, you have to recall the era when the camera was first invented and the photograph was considered to be the most objective of element. In fact, the name of the lens word itself comes from the French word called objectif. Now, when the camera was invented, there was a much debated topic how it subverted the human agency to create an image through a mechanical process. But there can be no framing without the human intervention. The purpose of the camera itself is a human in nature. The conduit itself is the subversion of any attempt at constituting reality. Media messages as transformative, which is our last and the third proposition here, rests on two basic premises. One, the role of media is to entertain and induce pleasure, and number two, the transformation idea is to show a ideal society free from the evils present. The transformative debate itself is criticized because to achieve an ideal society is almost impossible and is contrary to the idea of being realistic in portrayal. While people might argue that the basic idea of doing entertainment might be true, and indeed as culture industry had proposed, we have seen that the job of the entertainment industry is conducted through culture industry. So thus, although to an extent people might believe it to be true, there cannot still be a singular notion of work and entertainment. So we find all the three propositions have got their own critics. Communication scholars such as Harold Laswell believed in the functionalist approach to media messages, while the sociologist Charles Wright quite late in 1975, now we have to take the timing into consideration. Harold Laswell was writing in the 1948s, 40 and the 50s, while the sociologist Charles Wright in 1975 took this idea of the functionalist approach forward in his classical book called The Mass Communication, a Sociological Perspective, and he also added the concept of dysfunction. Now, this is a very important idea. Now, I will move to the territory of popular culture. Popular culture in its entirety is ideas, perspectives, attitudes, images, and other phenomena that are within the mainstream of a given culture, especially the emerging global mainstream of the late 20th and the early 21st century. Now, Raymond Williams of the Birmingham School defined culture as a particular way of life. Although most of the time the term popular carries a very low connotation to it, in turn heavily influenced by the idea of mass media. This collection of ideas thus permeate the everyday lives of society. So, here we have already identified that there exists a high and a low culture. Now, it depends on media, created images for its sustenance and even production. Everything that has acceptance among the large section of society is considered popular. The American cultural theorist John Fiske argues culture to be the production of continuities across domains of experience. But Popular culture is often viewed as being trivial and dumbed down in order to find this consensual acceptance throughout the mainstream. As a result, it comes under heavy criticism from various non-mainstream sources which deem it superficial, consumerist, sensationalist and corrupted. The term popular culture was actually coined in the 19th century or earlier probably. Traditionally, the term has denoted the education and general culture of the lower classes as opposed to the official culture and higher education emanated by the dominant classes. Following major cultural and social changes brought by mass media innovations, the meaning of popular culture began to overlap with those of mass culture, media culture, image culture, consumer culture, and culture for mass consumption. There are scholars such as John Fiske who have also argued that audience members are not always hopelessly dominated by media messages and the culture industry. Fiske shows how symbolic forms ranging from torn blue jeans to pop singers and songs are used creatively by fans to promote their interests. Now, Fiske was of the opinion that fans have a way in which they accept media messages. They not necessarily are overawed by these messages. We have actually seen this sort of a reaction from fans of Rajnikant, for example. Nearer home, we have also seen fans in other cultures across the country, let's say Shah Rukh Khan from the Bollywood film industry, or if we look in Bengal, actors such as Jeet. So we will find that these actors and their fan bases necessarily are not reacting in awe of the star, but they take these messages and use it in their own societal relations. Slowly, in postmodern terminology, the distinction between the high and the low and media played an important role in the acceptance of popular culture as a distinctly separate accepted term. Thus, today, popular culture finds manifestations in music, comics, graffiti, television, radio, tabloids, fashion, food, etc., etc. When the popular culture emerged, it actually terrified both purists and academics alike because of its non-conformity to acceptable tastes of culture. The ever-expanding reign of the popular, from carnival culture to pop culture to body art to street art to fashion, all actually stretched the boundaries of accepted culture and seemed to take the limits of vulgar and dictating the commercial marketplace. You will appreciate the fact today that maybe 3 decades back, the concept of a torn jeans or a body tattoo would not have been as acceptable as they are today. Today, they are probably not only pop culture but probably mainstream culture. Body art, for example, body piercing, for example, has gone on to a completely different level today. So, these have stretched the boundaries of what we term as accepted cultures. Today, these agents of street culture and non-elites per se help produce and receive pop culture in the arena of mediated communication, producing symbolic power structures. Now, I move on to the arena of the public sphere, and herein I will also be using it to explain newer concepts such as social media. Now, generally understood, the public sphere is a common realm where individuals discuss, come together and talk societal problems, and through that discussion influence political action by creating an opinion in its favor. Now, it is a discursive space in which individuals and groups congregate to discuss matters of mutual interest, and where it is possible to reach a common judgment. Now, this is very interesting to understand that the public sphere has always been a discursive space. It has been a space to discuss and debate and solve problems facing the larger society. The public sphere, therefore, is differentiated from the private sphere of the feudal societies. We have to keep in mind, because in the feudal societies, the decision making was in the hands of a select few individuals who had control over the means of production and consumption. But the rise of modern democracies gave rise to a public sphere that was far more egalitarian and inclusive. The public sphere mediates between the private sphere and the sphere of the public authority, the state. The sphere of the public authority dealt with the state or realm of the police, let us say, and the ruling class. The public sphere crossed over both these realms, and through the vehicle of public opinion that it generated, it put the state in touch with the needs of the society. So, you can understand that there is a connection between the public sphere and the public state. These two are connected through a well established notion of spheres, which is discursive. The public sphere is also distinct from the official economy. It is not an arena of market relations, but rather one of discursive relations, a theatre for debating and deliberating rather than for buying and selling, a very important proposition. Now, the basic belief in public sphere theory is that political action is steered by the public sphere, and that the only legitimate government are those that listen to the public sphere. So, the public sphere actually, by its very nature of composition, lends legitimacy to the idea of the government or the state. Democratic governance, therefore, rests on the capacity of and opportunity for citizens to engage in enlightened debate. Much of the debate over the public sphere involves what is the basic theoretical structure of the public sphere, how information is deliberated in the public sphere, and what influence the public sphere has over society. Now, innovations in technology have given the human race to comprehend the ideas of the public sphere in the virtual terms as well. Now, technological advances, as you well know, in the field of internet have paved the way for virtual communities to exist. Now, you are well acquainted with social media. I am not going to name them, but few of these examples of social media actually started by what we call today as the whole earth electronic link, WELL. These are some of the earliest virtual spheres that were established over the internet. Now, communication through such forums such as WELL allowed people to participate irrespective of their class, language, religion, race or whatever, in fact nationalities also. Now, interaction is virtual and even identities tend to be virtual in nature. Now, I am talking about a time before your Facebook was there or even your Orkut was there. The mediation through technology creates unique opportunities of expressing ideas, making friends, sharing opinions, and even making communities which themselves are virtual rather than face to face. As a direct result of the natural progression in the field of social media, the term that is now increasingly being used for such web technologies, the Habermasian concept of public sphere, has increasingly come under the lens. The Arab Spring, if you would remember, the Anna Hazare movement in India, or let us say Barack Obama's electoral campaigns, etc., have increasingly pointed towards the definitional lacunae in explaining this new public. The public in the social media, although rooted in the local, was increasingly becoming part of the global by voicing concerns on issues of worldwide interest. The idea of citizenship was increasingly being questioned. The new global public came across as an activist, a protester, and a bearer of change, who had lost patience with the state to act on its lines. Some examples of social media and the way that they create the sphere are Facebook, one of the most prominent websites today, now a listed company, and one of the most valued media companies, which started off as a college post and ended up being a network that runs around the world. Posts, messages, communities, photo sharing are some of the essential ways in which Facebook, for example, gets people hooked to each other. The concept of the global public is possible only because we have overcome the political boundaries through social media. The individual, which is very important in this whole debate, as the agent for social change, is possible in an era of capitalist economy. Francis Fukuyama, a scholar, in his book The End of History and the Last Man, published in the year 1992, had argued that at the end of the Cold War, market fundamentalism was to be the religion that gave us domestic bliss at home and abroad. This was perhaps the most pessimistic of all ages. Public dissent had been silenced all across, and people across the globe seemed to agree to this idea of Fukuyama. Now, the coming of social media changed this basic argument, and a visible change in power structure from the state to the individual had been observed. This change in locus of the citizenship from a more local to a global, with a shift in the power, was argued by scholars such as David Held. We can also talk about the scholar called Manuel Castells, who in his seminal work Network Society was also talking about the shift in power structures. Also, in this context, it is important to mention the work of scholars such as Arjun Appadurai, who believed that the rise in media and communication technologies and a fast moving capital market economy have only increased the gap between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots. This technological gap, he argues, makes people anxious about their ever-changing identities, which in fact has the potential for violence, according to Appadurai. Let us for a moment look at this changing shift of power from the state to the individual as media and the markets evolved in distinctly three phases. Firstly, the phase where regulatory powers were shifted from the state to multinational financial corporations. The shift in income was essentially, if you look closely, was from labor to capital centric. Parallel to this was an increase, or rather an influx, in communication technologies that saw media power trickle down from a few to many in this phase. The audience was now more in control of the processes of information making. The democratization of the process of media making took place, and the transfer of political power was taking place subsequently. In the second phase, just as the arrival of the printed text gave birth to a nation and national identity, drawing from the work of the renowned scholar Benedict Anderson and his work The Imagined Communities, the printed text, the museum, the map, etc. firmly rooted the individual and the community to a local level, albeit creating a national identity. The same way, the hypertext in a communication and technological age made people connect to each other irrespective of this geography and national boundaries through networked public. We might even call it a transfer of power from the national level to that of a transnational existence. People, irrespective of nationalities, creed, color, or religion, could opine, discuss, talk, and debate, and thus create in this process a new public sphere. The same person, for example, who might be talking about potholes in his neighborhood or rather say in the next street, might also be participating on debates surrounding plastics found in ocean or global warming. So what you see is the same person might be talking on local as well as on global terms. The hyperlink, just like the hyperspace, becomes symbolic of postmodern identity, where the notion of state control and regulations probably do not matter anymore. The third phase is that the global public that is thus created in this process is beyond normative citizenship practices as defined in national terms. This creates the base for transnational global action, where individuals can gather, talk, and take action on any matter that affects the globe. This power to the individual is in a sense more engaging, and people rise to the occasion whenever they feel like and disengage also rather easily. There is diversity at the base of this proposition, and microactivism is a thing to stay in the social media world. The influence of social media is such that today every media house has their own account on these sites to update about their programs or activities or any other thing they might be doing. This is the place where they get seen and heard. The social media has become so powerful and influential that every news channel has a program slot on the views expressed in such forums. Not only that, audience polls on issues are also conducted on social media accounts. A case in point would be if you would watch prime time news on Indian news channels, you would realize that every such channel would be conducting a poll on the opinion they express right at that moment. Might be on Twitter or Facebook, and there would be enthusiastic social media citizens who would be answering that poll. So this is something that the flow of information is something that goes from social media to normative media and from normative media to social media as well. Information flow today thus is a worldwide phenomenon where the producers are not located to a single geographical location. It might be anywhere in the world. So what is also another question that crops up here is that normal citizenship practices are increasingly being questioned. Do you belong to a particular space, territory, or a country, or do you belong to the globe? And social media seems to have diluted those spaces. Boundaries have become more liminal in effect. The democratization of the mediascape is a reality where every country actively engages and decides what is suited for it and thus makes rule for itself. Thus, while Egypt banned all forms of social media during the Arab Spring uprising, if you remember, at the same time China has banned some mainstream websites including such as Google. Now, the increasing power to the individual has made some of the governments to actually sit up and take notice of their own shrinking space and the rise of the global citizen. It is finally that the government is waking up to the power of the individual. So, this is the three-phase process in which through social media the individual has become lot more powerful. He has transcended individual national boundaries to become a local as well as a global citizen at the same point in time. Friends, we have come to the end of this lecture, and I hope by now you have realized the fact that media is not an isolated entity, but rather it works in an ecosystem where various other factors influence its role. In this lecture, we have seen major ideas such as propaganda, popular culture, audience, public sphere, and social media. With this, we come to the end of part 2 on the lecture on media, culture, and society. Thank you. Goodbye.